If students don't raise their voices about important policy and constitutional issues, who will?
Colleges and institutions are places where people practice the act of gaining knowledge, and therefore that's what they should be used for.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what promises to be a very lively, very contentious debate. You know, when I saw the subject, I was transported to my student days, and I'm now talking largely of the 1970s, spilling over a bit into the 80s. And I wondered whether this subject would have been debatable in the 1970s. Because in the 1970s, the fact that student politics and student activism and studies were one organic whole, one led to the other, one sort of interacted, and there was really no separation between the church and state there. Students were always politically active and politically alive, and the proof of the pudding clearly is in the eating, right? I mean, we saw some of the biggest protest movements of the 1960s, 70s, even the 80s. Were very largely propelled by student power. In our own country, we of course had the whole Naxal movement. We had the Navnirman movement. We had the student movement of, which led by JP, which led to the imposition of emergency. Within the emergency, we had very active student reactions to the imposition of emergency. Across the globe, we of course had the Vietnam protest. We even had the Tiananmen Square protest in China. So, then it was very difficult to say that students should not or could not or would not be part of political protest. But 40 years out since that time, I think some sort of evolutionary change on a rather remarkable scale has happened, and therefore the issue is now debatable. The issue is now contentious. What's happened? Today we are living in a very hyper digital, a very hyper connected, a very hyper competitive, a very sort of a hyper specialized world. Very different from the world as it existed in the 70s. And in today's world, you cannot scrub anything that you do. There is, of course, the fundamental argument that students are, financial dependents, and yet they are adults. So they face the full force of any reaction. They face the full force of any of the law, but they're not financially independent. So they're vulnerable. Also, the fact that they are now so much within a digital echo chamber, so much more within a competitive world, that it becomes almost impossible for them, as I said, to leave the past behind. So they are particularly vulnerable. And also, student age is an age of rebellion, right? It's an age of being emotional. While I'm not saying they're not mature, there are life's experiences that you need to go through to become fully mature and to fully understand things in their nuance and their sensitivity. So they are particularly vulnerable to being ideologically indoctrinated, to being becoming cynical, sort of pawns in a cynical power play. So there are arguments now which say that they should perhaps focus on studies and look upon this as a phase of life and a stage of life. And once studies are over, go out into the world and do whatever you want to do as an adult. So there are arguments on both sides. And that, I think, sets us up so nicely for the debate. After all, it is 2021 and no longer the 1970s.
The only thing that needs to be underlined again and again is that we are debating whether educational institutions, colleges themselves, should be used for quote unquote political protests that are so venal, so violent, that no less than the Kerala High Court has passed judgment saying that universities and colleges deserve the right to stop this kind of activity. We are not talking about black bands being flown. We are not talking about Twitter messages. We are not talking about poems being written. We are talking about the political protests that plague most of our universities. And the point about only 3 or 4 universities consistently, year after year, popping up in the top 200 colleges, we have to ask ourselves if we can afford more disruption to education, where not a single university, even today, actually from India even pops up in the top 100 list. We have 4, and all 4 of them are technical universities, right, which most of them are free from this plague. We have to create better education spaces.
Part of the reason that people and Hindol and Shubhrastha oppose student participation in public dissent is out of concern for student safety. But the question is, why does this fear of arrest or charges arise in the first place when non-violent protests are perfectly constitutional? Violence is condemnable. And it is important that students ensure that protest remains non-violent under all circumstances. But it is even more important for the state to be non-violent as well. And the students should be able to oppose state actions that cross this line in any form. In India, the frequency and list of reasons for slamming charges on student activists have grown alarmingly under the BJP routine. It is the state that has tainted student protest as subversion, and crackdown on the so-called anti-national participants, making it increasingly risky to publicly question and denounce political bills and actions.
In order for students to understand really what nationalism is beyond the precincts of what their professors teach, it's important for them to hit the ground and understand nationalism from the point of view of the villages and villages of India, folk songs of different localities, and then make up their mind about nationalism, because nationalism is not just Tagore's idea or Anderson's idea, or the whole notion of Ghare Baire that we studied. So it's very important for us to understand that there's a distinction between activism and protest. Not only this government, previous governments have also not had a very good track record in the minds of intellectuals when it came to student protests. We all know about emergency.
I'd really like to tell everyone here that before I went abroad, I studied law in a college called the Government Law College in Mumbai, and it was set up in the 1850s during the colonial period. And the motto of this college, set up during the colonial period, was Nevel Fano in Latin, which means let nothing evil enter. And by nothing evil, the college administration were really worried about political protest. You see, they didn't want lawyers, they didn't want law students protesting, because they knew how dangerous that could be to the existence of the British regime in India. So make no mistake about it, the administration is very worried about students who protest. In the 1970s, the Navnirman movement in Gujarat, the JP movement in Bihar, which was alluded to, threatened to topple the Congress government and was cited as a cause for imposing the emergency in June 1975. If there was a law that were enacted by Parliament that college students should not participate in political protests, it would be struck down overwhelmingly as being unconstitutional. It is overbroad. Right. It distinguishes between college students and high school students. It doesn't define what protests are. So that's all I really have to say.
That's more than a sentence. Thank you, Abhinav.